Good morning. My name is Rachel Lawler, and I am a survey analyst with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and the environment. This survey and today's event is supported with funding from the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and the Dirk and Charlene Cabsnell Foundation. We thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague Deja Thomas will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey, and then we will discuss some of our main takeaways and answer any questions from the audience. But before I introduce my colleague, I do have a couple of housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And if you have a question about the survey, please send an email to the address that's on your screen now. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And please remember to include your name and your organization along with your question. So now I would like to welcome my colleague, fellow survey analyst, Deja Thomas. Deja?
Thank you, Rachel, for that great introduction, and thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in our work. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report, which include Rachel, as well as Dean Bonner and Mark Baldessari. I'd also like to echo Rachel by acknowledging our funders for the survey, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and the Dirk and Charlene Cabsnell Foundation. Without their support, this work wouldn't be possible. This survey is part of our Californians and the Environment series, which is now in its 22nd year. The survey's covered many state and national issues since 2000, and for those of you who might be joining us for the first time or might be unfamiliar with the work that we do at the PPIC statewide survey, its mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, which we hope will be used to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. The PPIC survey covers public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences, and for this series, all related to the environment. Since the start of the survey, PPIC has provided a voice for more than 400,000 Californians on more than 200 general, issue-specific, and regional surveys. This particular survey was conducted online from July 8th to the 15th using the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, and interviews were conducted in either English or Spanish according to respondent preferences. Our sample includes about 1,600 California adults and a little over 1,000 of those respondents who we've identified as likely voters. And the margin of error is 3.4 for adults and 4.1 for likely voters. Majorities of adults and likely voters approve of Governor Newsom and the state legislature's handling of environmental issues. And at the federal level, about half of adults and likely voters approve of President Biden's handling of environmental issues, but just a quarter approve of the US Congress. Environmental approval ratings at the state level have remained similar to a year ago, but we've seen a decline in environmental approval when it comes to Biden and Congress. However, it's important to note that majorities have disapproved of Congress since 2011. Partisans vary when it comes to these approval ratings, with Democrats most likely to approve across the board and Republicans most likely to disapprove across the board. We asked people to name the most important environmental issue facing the state today, and looking only at mentions of 5% or more, 3 in 10 said water and drought, 13% said wildfires, and 11% mentioned climate change. So these shares are actually somewhat similar among likely voters as well. And looking back at 2021, Californians named the same top 3 issues, and the shares of adults saying these top 3 issues are important are actually as similar as they were a year ago. And looking across all demographic and party groups, water and drought was a top issue, and across regions as well. And that's about 3 in 10 or fewer across all subgroups, just to round that out. And in the context of a continuing drought and record low reservoirs, both of which have likely affected the day-to-day lives of Californians, we find that most adults say water supply is at least somewhat of a problem, including 68% of adults and somewhat more likely voters who say it is a big problem. The share of adults saying this has remained similar to a year ago, while there's been a slight increase in likely voters. Today, solid majorities among partisan and demographic groups and across regions say this is a big problem. Looking at regions a little more closely, we see that the shares range from 76% in the Inland Empire to 64% in Orange, San Diego. And while many say the supply of water is a big problem, most are unhappy with efforts by state and local governments and other people in their part of California to respond to the drought. Today, 68% of adults and 3/4 of likely voters say the state and local government is not doing enough to respond to the current drought. Fewer than 3 in 10 say they're doing the right amount, and 4% say they're doing too much. Majorities across partisan and demographic groups and across regions say the government is not doing enough. And similarly, when it comes to other people in their part of the state, about 7 in 10 adults and likely voters say they're not doing enough to respond to the current drought. About 1/4 say they're doing the right amount, and 4% say they're doing too much. Solid majorities across partisan groups say this, but Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say this. 6 in 10 or more across demographic groups agree that people are not doing enough in their part of California. And moving on to the next slide, while most people are dissatisfied with efforts to respond to the drought, many say they've done at least a little to reduce water use, with 45% and half of likely voters saying they've done a lot. And 16% say they haven't taken any steps to reduce water use. Los Angeles residents are most likely across regions to say this at about half, while residents in Orange, San Diego are least likely to say this. Half or fewer across demographic groups say that they've done a lot, reaching at least 50% among Latinos, adults ages 55 and older, and people with high school educations only. Looking at income groups, people making $80,000 or more are less likely than adults with lower incomes to say they've done a lot. And with wildfire season upon us, more than 8 in 10 Californians say the threat of wildfires is at least somewhat of a problem in their part of the state, including more than 4 in 10 adults and likely voters who say it is a big problem. The share saying wildfires are a big problem is lower than it was 1 year ago. And looking at partisan groups today, half of Democrats say this compared to somewhat fewer Republicans and independents. Among racial ethnic groups, pluralities of Latinos, African Americans, and whites say that it's a big problem compared to just 35% of Asian Americans. And across the state's regions, the majority of Inland Empire residents say this compared to smaller shares in other regions. A majority of California adults and likely voters are at least somewhat concerned about the threat of power shutoffs aimed to prevent wildfires where they live, including about 2 in 10 who are very concerned. About 1 in 4 Republicans say they're very concerned, and they're also more likely than Democrats and independents at fewer than 2 in 10 each to say this. Across demographic groups, about 2 in 10 or fewer are very concerned. The share saying they are very concerned increases as income decreases, and across regions, residents in the Inland Empire are more likely than adults in other regions to say this. About 7 in 10 adults and likely voters say the effects of climate change have already begun, while fewer say it will start in a few years, within their lifetime, will not happen in their lifetime, but will affect future generations, or will not happen at all. The share saying that the effects have already begun to show are similar to last year, and Majorities have said this since 2005. Views across partisan groups are varied, with overwhelming majorities of Democrats and independents saying that we've already seen the effects of climate change compared to fewer than half of Republicans. Solid majorities across regions and demographic groups say this. And in our survey this year, we saw varying degrees of public support for some specific state-level climate change policies. Adults and likely voters are overly in favor of AB 32, which is the state law that requires California to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030, as well as SB 100, which is the state law requiring 100% of the state's electricity to come from renewable sources by the year 2045. Governor Newsom's plan to ban new fracking permits in the state by 2024 has the support of about 6 in 10 adults and likely voters, while his executive order to ban the sale of gas-powered cars by the year 2035 has less support, at just shy of half among both adults and likely voters. Partisans are deeply divided on all of these climate change policies, with Democrats most likely to support them and Republicans most likely to oppose them. We are seeing majority support across regions and demographic groups for all of these policies, with the exception of Newsom's executive order to ban the sale of gas-powered cars. Here we see support only reaches a majority among Latinos, high-income adults, younger adults, and among residents in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. With the highest average gas prices in the country, just shy of $6 per gallon, we wanted to ask about financial hardship that Californians may be facing due to increased gas prices. Today, majorities of adults and 52% of likely voters say it's caused some level of hardship for them and their households. However, twice as many say it's caused them moderate hardship than severe hardship. Among partisans, a quarter of Republicans and 2 in 10 independents say they've faced severe hardship compared to 1 in 10 Democrats. Latinos and African Americans are twice as likely, roughly twice as likely as Asian Americans and whites to say they've faced severe hardship for this reason. And adults earning less than $40,000 a year are the most likely across income groups, and actually the most likely across all demographic groups to say this. And looking at the state's major regions, 2 in 10 or more residents in the Inland Empire, Central Valley, and Los Angeles report severe hardship compared to fewer in other regions. About 3 in 4 adults and likely voters would prioritize developing alternative energy sources such as wind, solar, and hydrogen technology to address the country's energy supply over expanding the exploration of oil, coal, and natural gas. Overwhelming majorities of adults also favored alternative energy sources a year ago, when 80% said this. Last year, majorities across partisan groups said they prioritized alternative energy. However, this year we're seeing an increasing divide in views. Today, majorities of Democrats and independents would favor alternative energy, while 6 in 10 Republicans favor fossil fuels. Today, 2/3 or more across regions and demographic groups would prioritize alternative energy, and the share of saying this increases as age decreases. And like I mentioned earlier, amid these record-setting fuel prices, half of adults and likely voters have seriously considered purchasing an electric vehicle, while 45% have not, and just 6% say they've already have one. Among partisans, Democrats and independents are far more likely than Republicans to consider buying, and among racial ethnic groups, half or more of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos have contemplated this compared to fewer whites. That said, it's worth noting that Asian Americans and whites are more than twice as likely to say they've already got an electric car than African Americans or Latinos. The share who have considered this falls with increasing age and rises sharply as educational attainment and income increases. Okay, so our survey covered a lot of other topics as well, and some of them are listed here for you to see. I would encourage you all to take a look at the crosstabs and the survey report on our website, as well as the blogs that Mark has written or other blogs that we're working on right now that are soon to be published. And that concludes my presentation, but I'd like to remind everyone in the audience to please submit questions at ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and the name of your organization when you submit your question. With that, I'll turn it over to Rachel for the key takeaways and other important findings in the report.
Great. Wow, thanks so much for that really fantastic summary, Deja. Having worked closely with you on this survey, I know we just had so many topics and timely topics and interesting findings to choose from. And you did a great job highlighting some of the important findings about the current events and critical environmental issues. So thank you so much for that. I would like to echo Deja's sentiment about going to the PPIC website and taking a look at the full report, as well as our crosstab and time trend data. There's just so much there. I think we had about 70 questions on the environment, so lots of really good stuff. And you can look up specific questions and see how different people across the state feel about them. So highly recommend doing that. I did want to briefly talk about some of the other topics that Deja mentioned at the end that we did ask about in our survey, but that we weren't able to cover today. First, I did want to take a look at our findings on the possible impacts of climate change. As Deja mentioned, about 7 in 10 Californians think that the effects of climate change have already started to happen. So we followed that question up with several questions about how concerned Californians are about some specific potential impacts of climate change in the future. And we found that about 2/3 of adults are very concerned about droughts that are more severe because of climate change, and another 25% are somewhat concerned about this. We also find that a majority of 57% are very concerned about wildfires that are more severe. An additional 30% are somewhat concerned about that. Concerns then lessen a little bit when it comes to heat waves that are more severe. About half of Californians are very concerned and a third are somewhat concerned. And finally, we find that % of adults are very concerned and another 37% are somewhat concerned about an increase in rising sea levels due to climate change. So overall, a majority of Californians expressed some concern about these 4 potential impacts, but certainly folks are most concerned about the potential for droughts and wildfires that are more severe. And unfortunately, these just happen to be 2 situations that California is currently facing, right now. If we take this data and we break it down by different demographic groups, we find that Latinos are more likely than other racial and ethnic groups, and women are more likely than men, and Democrats are more likely than Republicans or independents, to say that they're very concerned about all 4 of these potential impacts. And regionally, we find concern about more severe droughts and heat waves is highest in the Inland Empire, while concern about rising sea levels is most pronounced in Los Angeles, while wildfires is highest, the biggest concern for San Francisco Bay Area residents. So, some other findings that I wanted to highlight relate to ocean, coastal, and marine life issues. So obviously our coastline and beaches are something that makes California unique, and it draws lots of people to the state, both to live and for tourism. And we find that 58% of adults think the condition of our oceans and beaches is very important to the economy, as well as the quality of life in California's future. That said, 9 in 10 Californians think ocean and beach pollution is a problem along the coast, and 40% actually say that it's a big problem. We also find that almost everyone in the state, 95%, think plastics and marine debris are a problem, and a majority think that they are a big problem. There are some differences in opinion among demographic groups that I wanted to mention. We find that lower income residents and Latinos are more likely to say that all three issues are big problems, while women are more likely than men, and Democrats are more likely than Republicans and independents to say plastics, as well as ocean and beach pollution are big problems in the part of the coast that is closest to where they live. And finally, I wanted to make a couple comments about California's drinking water supply. So obviously the state is facing a serious drought, a historic drought, which is one important element of our water supply. But another aspect of that is that of safe and clean drinking water, which every Californian has the right to under our state law. And an article recently came out from Cal Matters that talked about an audit that was done that found 1 million residents lack access to safe drinking water. So we asked a couple questions, given the survey was conducted before that article came out, but we did have a couple questions on this topic in our survey. And first, we found that 69% of adults and majorities across regions and across all of the demographic groups that we capture believe that pollution of drinking water is a more serious health threat in lower income communities than it is in other areas. And if we dig a little bit deeper into the topic, we asked respondents how serious a health threat pollution of drinking water is to them themselves and to their families. And although 52% said that this is not too serious of a threat, we did find that 16% of adults said it is a very serious threat, and another 31% said it's somewhat serious. So that is a very large portion of the population who is saying that they don't think their water is necessarily safe for them to drink. There are a few notable differences among subgroups. Regionally, Inland Empire and Los Angeles area residents are more likely than Californians living elsewhere to say that polluted drinking water is a serious threat. And if we look at the data among racial ethnic groups, we find that 33% of African Americans and 24% of Latinos say it's a serious threat compared to, a very serious threat compared to just 11% of Asian Americans and 10% of whites. And we also find that the shares saying it is a serious threat declines as educational attainment and income levels increase. So there are certainly some quite large differences when it comes to the disproportionate impact of potentially polluted drinking water within certain communities in California. So with that, we'd like to go ahead and start answering the questions that you have sent in from the audience. And as a reminder, it's not too late to submit a question. Please send them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And we can go ahead and start with the first one that has come in. So I'll go ahead and read it. We're in the middle of a historic drought as well as facing another wildfire season. Does the survey shed light on how Californians connect with these challenges, or excuse me, how Californians connect these challenges with climate change? Deja, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So while I didn't include this in today's slides, these findings are discussed in the report. We asked these questions about possible impacts of climate change, and in this year's environment survey, we found that majorities are very concerned about droughts that are more severe and wildfires that are more severe. And you talked about this a little bit, but nearly half are concerned about heat waves as well that are more severe as an impact of climate change in California. Again, I can't remember the breaks off the top of my head, but they're definitely in the report, so I encourage everyone to check those out. Rachel, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks for that reminder, Deja. I think it makes sense that people are concerned about these, the impacts that we asked about, because we did also find that overwhelming majorities of more than 3 in 4 adults answered that they do believe that climate change has contributed to the state's current drought, as well as to recent wildfires. Majorities across the regions, as well as demographic groups, say this. So this is a very common and widespread belief among Californians. So, okay, next question. How has, how has the top environmental issue among Californians changed or shifted over time? And why do you think this is? Do you want to take the first
sure, yeah.
crack at it, Deja?
Sure thing. So this year's findings for that question are actually really similar to last year's. I think I'd mentioned that a little bit early on in the presentation. But looking back to a year ago, the top 3 environmental issues were water and drought, wildfires, and climate change, just as they are right now. And even then, the top line shares were also very similar. We would call them similar. But looking back a little bit further to the year 2020, just 10% mentioned water and drought as compared to the 3 in 10 today. But back then we saw, I feel like there was a wider range of environmental issues being mentioned as the most important. And overall, I think that the changes we see year to year, maybe they're reflections of like specific events that are happening in the state, especially during our fielding period. Rachel, you might have more insight on this since you've been at PPIC longer than I have, but do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think you summed it up nicely. There's always a few different issues that kind of duke it out to get the top spot on the list each year, but it tends to be the same 3 or 4 issues: water, wildfires, climate change, pollution, things like that. I do agree that I think what ends up being at the top is largely a reflection of what's going on in California at that time. I do think perhaps if we had fielded the survey maybe a week or 2 after we did, perhaps wildfires would be at the top of the list because of the fire that's burning near Yosemite and really been in the news lately. So yeah, and I also think that the issues that tend to be at the top, at least a good portion of them, are not necessarily unique to only California, but they're a little bit more prevalent in California than other areas of the country. Wildfires, floods, not floods, the opposite of a flood, a drought. So I think maybe, people they're more aware of those things because they're experiencing them on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. All right, so next question. Your presentation, your presentation notes that about half of Californians approve of President Biden's handling of the environment. How does this compare to his overall approval rating, and are there any time trends of note? I can go ahead and start on this one. So in this survey, we only asked about President Biden in the context of his handling of environmental issues. And Deja, as she mentioned towards the beginning, 49% of adults approve, and voters 49% as well. But that has declined substantially from 61% who approved last July. We do ask about Biden's overall approval. The last time we asked about that was in our May survey, the Californians and their government series. And at that time, his approval was 50% among all adults and 48% among likely voters. So almost identical to the president's approval ratings on the environment. The decline that we are seeing in both his environmental and overall approval is similar to what we've seen in national polls. However, I do think that perhaps this decline's a little bit slower and less substantial in California, given the largely Democratic makeup of the electorate. So that's my take on that question. Deja, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you've summed it up pretty nicely. I agree. I think that it is true that his environmental approval is similar to his overall approval. And the decline that we're seeing is, as you said, it's kind of similar to what we're seeing in other national polls and orgs who do the same kind of work as us. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. All right, so here's another question that just came through, and this is a really interesting one. What do you make of the fact that a majority have faced financial hardship due to gas prices, but also that most Californians do not support Governor Newsom's executive order about banning gas cars? I'll just quickly comment and then turn it over to you, Deja. I think there is some skepticism about perhaps the feasibility of his executive order, and I think that might, I mean, this is my personal view. We don't have any data to back that up, but I think there might be some concerns about feasibility if that's possible. Obviously, the most populous state in the nation, as well as things like how much the cost of electric vehicles, how much they cost, and we saw that they're about half have seriously considered it, but that is heavily dependent on income and things like that. So, I think there's a little bit of a what would we like to do versus what is feasible, and that's coming into play here. Deja, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said, and I also want to add that I mentioned kind of that, like, the people who are having the most, who are struggling the most right now are, like they're usually lower income, and there's like some more specific breaks across racial ethnic groups. But I also, like, again, we don't have data for this, but I think that has a lot to do with that level of support that we're seeing, or the lack of support that we're seeing for Newsom's order on banning gas powered cars. And I wonder, well, no, I don't wonder, but I think that there's a lot of like economic issues going on here. People are struggling, and we've seen that in our one question about whether they're having moderate or severe hardship, and most people are saying they're having at least some level of hardship. So I think it makes sense that a lot of people aren't supporting that policy right now. It's all about being able to afford an electric car if gas cars are now banned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there definitely is a difference. People are having hardships, but there's a big difference in paying, say, $50, $60, whatever it is, extra for a tank of gas versus paying, tens of thousands of dollars for a new car. So I think that's absolutely true. So here's another question from the audience. For the past 3 years, offshore wind has been a discussion in California. Last week, the governor set a goal of at least 20 gigawatts of offshore wind energy off the coast of California by 2045. Did the survey ask any questions about offshore wind? Deja, I'm not sure if you have, since we didn't talk about this in the presentation, I do have our data pulled up on that question. If you also do, please feel free to go ahead and answer. If not, I'm happy to.
Yeah, I've got it pulled up. I was wondering if someone would ask this kind of question. But basically, so we did ask a question about wind and wave power off the coast, and we found widespread support for people who, we found widespread support for allowing wind power and wave energy off the coast at 81% of adults and 85% of likely voters saying they're in favor, and there are overwhelming majorities across demographic groups and across regions who are in favor, and support is similar in coastal and inland areas. So, overall, there's a lot of support for this policy, and I know that early on in the year, there was news about Biden's wind power efforts in relation to California. But yeah, about it. Rachel,
Yeah.
anything else you want to add there?
Yeah, you touched on it, that there's widespread support, but this is one area where we do see overwhelming majorities across parties in favor of wind and wave energy. So, on a topic where there is so much division in terms of political ideologies, this is one area where there is agreement. So that might be one of the, be a good starting point for California to kind of build consensus around some of these issues. So here's another question. The survey talks about views on alternative energy and prioritizing it over fossil fuels. Does it say anything about whether amid a period of inflation overall, people would be willing to pay more for renewable energy? Deja, did you want to start on that one?
Yeah. So this year, yes, we did ask about Californians' willingness to pay more for electricity if they were generated by renewable sources, such as solar and wind energy. And we found that 44% of adults said they're willing to pay more, and 55% say they're willing to pay they were not willing to pay. We first asked this question in 2016, and at the time, 56% said they would be willing, and 40% say they wouldn't. However, since we've seen a steady decline in the share saying they're willing to pay, but this is alongside, like I had mentioned earlier in another question, the rising cost of living and housing in California, as well as the current period of, the high inflation and the gas prices. That's what I mentioned earlier. And I think that might explain a little bit more of the story. I also mentioned that the shares who are willing to pay, they only reach a majority among Democrats, adults ages 18 to 34, college graduates, and San Francisco Bay Area residents.
Yeah, that's a great summary, Deja. I couldn't have put it better myself. Okay, so I know we're getting close to the end of our program today, but we do have one more question that has come through. Was there anything that surprised you about this survey's findings? I think myself personally, I was a bit surprised that given the high gas prices and the majority, as we've discussed already, majority of people saying they have experienced some financial hardship because of fuel prices. I was a little surprised that the share who want to expand exploration and production of oil, coal, and natural gas wasn't a little bit higher, as Deja showed in her presentation. Just about a quarter want to make that the priority for our country's energy supply, versus about 3 in 4 who want to prioritize developing alternative energy sources. I will say we did see there was a very slight increase in the share who want to expand fossil fuels. It was 18% last July and 24% today. But I thought it might be a little bit higher, just given the pain at the pump that most Californians are experiencing. I also found that interesting in the context of 55% saying they're not willing to pay more for electricity generated from renewable sources. But if we do extrapolate just a little bit, everyone, with the exception of 60%, I believe, of Republicans, want to prioritize alternative energy. So it seems like, at least for the time being, most Californians haven't quite hit that point of no return in terms of finances that would maybe cause them to make the shift in priorities. And I think given how stark the numbers are, 74 versus 24, I don't foresee that happening anytime in the near future, if at all. So I think that was something that stuck out to me.
Yeah, definitely interesting. I felt like there was a lot that jumped out in this year's survey. I guess for me, I'd say that it's that slight disconnect that we saw between the share of respondents saying that they've made some effort, either a lot or a little, to reduce water use, compared to the share that's saying that they're dissatisfied with the efforts of other people in their communities to respond to the drought. Just to quickly reiterate the findings, 83% say they've taken steps to reduce water use, including 45% who say they've done a lot, and 2 in 3 adults say people in their communities aren't doing enough. And I'd have to take a closer look later to see if we asked both of these questions in the same survey before. But these findings kind of made me wonder what people would consider to be a lot or a little here.
Yeah, that's a great point, because it is a little bit subjective, what you consider a lot or a little. So definitely an interesting finding. Okay, so we have reached the end of our program. I would like to thank you, Deja, again for your great presentation. And once again, also, I would like to thank our survey funders. And finally, to all of you for joining us today online. If you happen to pre-register for this event, you will receive a survey from us. We would really appreciate you taking just a couple minutes to respond to that, to let us know how we did, so we can continue bringing you great programs like this and improve in the future. So everyone, please be safe and have a great afternoon.